Hey guys, this is Gabe, and I just wanted to let you know we're starting a new sermon series on Sunday called "Life as an Ambassador." And the idea for this sermon series came as I was looking at 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 20, which says, "Therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us, and we implore you on behalf of Christ, be reconciled to God." And I was just thinking how much our world needs ambassadors for Christ right now, needs the life and the hope and the grace of the gospel, and that's our responsibility and our opportunity is to be his ambassadors. And so I started there at that verse, and then I just kind of read around it, and I just kept expanding the reading and looked at all of Second Corinthians and thought, this is an amazing book, and I've never taught through Second Corinthians, and so I thought it would be a fun one to do a sermon series through. So we're going to spend the next few weeks, couple months probably, going through some pretty key passages in this letter that Paul wrote to the Corinthians. And so I thought what would be fun is right now just to take a few minutes to introduce you to this letter, introduce you to Paul's letter to the Corinthians, his second letter to the Corinthians, because on a Sunday morning and in the message, there's not always time to do that. We just don't always have that opportunity. So I wanted to be able to do that here. So I'm going to be giving you a little bit of the background, a little bit of history here. If you're interested in that, it helps a lot to know the history and the context before we dive into the letter itself. So let's just dive into it. The this book, it's called Second Corinthians, and so as you can imagine, it is a letter that Paul writes to the church that is in the city of Corinth. And Corinth was a city. If you have a Bible like mine, you might have a map, a set of maps at the back of it, and you can flip to one of the maps about Paul's missionary journeys back here, or you can find a map online. But what you'll see is that the city of Corinth, it's located in what we know of as Greece. You see Italy's boot, and then just to the east of that is Greece. And Corinth was a very important city that was located towards the southern part of Greece on this narrow little isthmus that is right between the Aegean and the Adriatic seas. And because of its location, it was an important port city where merchants and boats would come and they would kind of restock, refuel, drop off cargo, pick up cargo, that kind of thing. So there were no shortage of sailors coming through, and therefore there was no shortage of entertainment in the city. There were outdoor and indoor theaters, there were athletic games, an abundance of taverns, there were all kinds of different pagan temples and shrines. There was just a lot going on in the city of Corinth. And of all the churches that Paul planted and that Paul writes to, it seems as though Corinth is the one that more than any others struggles with immorality, struggles with just the influence of the world and making some really dangerous and really poor choices. And Paul deals with that in his letters to them. It was also kind of a melting pot, right? Because it's such a major port city, people from all over, of all different kinds of backgrounds, all different kinds of heritages. There's diversity in philosophical beliefs, there's diversity of religious background. And so it all kind of comes, all of that kind of comes together in Corinth, and it's not always easy. The church then is made up of Christians, those who believe in Christ, but they come from all different kinds of backgrounds. And so the church is constantly struggling to maintain unity in Christ because there's all these competing worldviews and political perspectives and things going on. And I know we have a hard time relating to that today, tongue in cheek, of course. But Paul had a special relationship with the church in Corinth, and it was on his second missionary journey. He went through and ended up in Corinth, and of all the cities that Paul planted churches in, this was the first city where he really had an extended stay. And he ended up staying in Corinth for 18 months. You can see that in Acts chapter 18. But the story of how he came to Corinth is important. So I'll walk you through that a little bit. You can find a lot of this in the book of Acts and then kind of piecing it together with some things he says in other letters. It was Acts chapter 16, verse 9, where Paul received this Macedonian call, where he had this dream of this man from Macedonia saying, "Come and help us." And Paul understood that to mean he needed to go to this region to preach the gospel. And so he does. He goes first to Philippi, and in Philippi he plants a church, and until he's imprisoned, and then he's released. And then he goes from Philippi, he goes to Thessalonica, and he plants a church there in Thessalonica. And then he ends up leaving there because there's a group of Jewish people who are jealous, and they're stirred up in their jealousy to anger, and they try to kill Paul. So he flees from Thessalonica and he goes to the city called Berea. And there in Berea, he is very well received and starts the church there until that angry mob from Thessalonica catches up to him and find him in Berea. And so he has to run again and he flees. It looks as though Paul left Silas in Berea, and then he sent Timothy, who had been with him, sent him back to Thessalonica, and then he went on his own to Athens, the great Greek capital. And when you read about his time in Athens, you read that there were some converts, but it was also a very difficult and frustrating mission field for Paul. And it doesn't look like he planted a church there at the time. And he doesn't stay long in Athens before he goes next to Corinth. And when he's in Corinth, he sends for Silas and Timothy, and they come back and rejoin him. And he meets a couple named Priscilla and Aquila. Maybe you've heard of them, who lived there in Corinth. And Paul actually goes into business with them, and he works while he's in Corinth as a tent maker to support his ministry and to support his work of the gospel as he makes it his mission in Corinth to plant a church. And that's what he does. So then he goes from Corinth. After about 18 months, he goes back to Jerusalem. Then he goes over to Ephesus, and he's in Ephesus for a couple of years and has some struggles there. But he never loses contact with the Corinthians, and actually writes a series of letters to them over a very short period of time. We only have 2 of the letters, but actually he wrote at least 4 letters to the Corinthians that we know of. And they were written very, in very short order, back to back. And he wrote them because while he was in Ephesus, he'd received a very disturbing update about the believers in Corinth. He'd heard that they were divided, there was division. He'd heard that there was a group of them who had started to attack his own credibility and character and reputation, and therefore attacked the gospel that he preached. He had heard reports of just unspeakable immorality. And so in response to that, Paul wrote a first letter. And we don't actually have that first letter. We don't know exactly word for word what he said. But in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 9, he alludes to it. He says, "I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people." So he alludes to the fact, I've already written a letter to you, and we know at least part of what that letter said. But clearly that letter didn't have the impact that he hoped it would have, because he receives another report on another status update on the Corinthians, and that report is just as discouraging, just as bad. And so, along with hearing that report, Paul also received a list of questions that the church had as they're trying to figure it out. How do we live together unified? How do we live together for the glory of Christ when we are so far from that ideal? They ask all these questions, and so Paul responds by writing another letter. And that is his second letter to the Corinthians, at least his second letter, but it's what we call 1 Corinthians. And so he wrote the letter, and then immediately after writing the letter, he decided he needed to visit. He wanted to follow up. It wasn't enough just to write a letter. He needed to go travel from Ephesus to Corinth and visit. And it doesn't sound like it was a very pleasant visit, because in 2 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 1, he says, For I made up my mind not to make another painful visit to you, which tells us that there had been a previous painful visit that Paul had to make to the Corinthians, likely painful because he had to confront them on some really difficult things that really were breaking his heart. And so he made that visit, but even that visit doesn't sound like it had the desired impact. And so Paul wrote a third letter. And again, unfortunately, we don't have this letter. We don't know exactly what Paul said, but we do know that he wrote another letter, because we read in 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 8, it says, For even if I made you grieve with my letter, I do not regret it, though I did regret it, for I see that that letter grieved you, though only for a while. So Paul wrote this third letter, and again, we don't have the letter, but his heart is very heavy, and he's not sure how they're going to receive this, because again, he already wrote them 2 letters. He's visited them, had that painful visit. Now he writes them this third letter, and his heart is heavy, and he doesn't know what's going on. But then Titus eventually comes to him with good news that now, after this third letter, the church is beginning to heal. And he's very excited about that. And his response to hearing that good news is to write a 4th letter, and that is the letter that we call 2 Corinthians. So 2 Corinthians is Paul's response to the good news that finally, after all the work that he's poured into this church, that they are finally starting to get it. And so what we have in 2 Corinthians is a letter of praise, a letter Paul's joyful, but it's a letter of encouragement. It's a letter in which Paul, we see themes of the comfort we have in Christ. We see themes of perseverance and having an eternal perspective. And most of all, we just see Paul talking about what it looks like to live a radically changed life. See, for us to be ambassadors for Christ, it's about living out a radically changed life. You can't be Christ's ambassador if your life hasn't been impacted by Christ himself. And so Paul gives the Corinthians and gives us all kinds of tools in this letter for how we can be ambassadors for Christ, for how we can live radically gospel-centered lives that are driven by the hope of the gospel, the joy of Christ. It's a beautiful letter. There's so many amazing passages in here. I'm really excited to dive into it with y'all. This is just a very brief introduction to the letter. There's more to it, but I think just even this will help us as we dive in on Sunday. Sunday, we're going to be looking at just the first chapter, verses 3 through 11, where Paul talks about the comfort that we have from God that we can pass on to other people. And it's such a timely passage for us today, and such an important passage. So I hope you're able to join us on Sunday, either in person or on our live stream. And I'm looking forward to studying this book with y'all. We'll talk to you soon. Bye.